I mean, come on. All these cosplay videos start out the same. I sit here in jammies and I tell you what I'm gonna do in a really weird way, and then voice over me will tell you what I'm gonna do in a more better way. This is a hot minute ago. Kageyama's birthday is coming up, and I've cosplayed Kageyama a bunch of times, and back in like 2017, I wanted to be King Kageyama with the cape and the crown, and I didn't finish it. And I looked on my calendar and I was like, oh my god, his birthday is coming up. I should finish it. I just end up wearing the uniform and I'm like, yeah, this is good enough. I look deep in my Instagram. You can actually find my original Anime Boston 2017 lineup and still see Kageyama in there, and I didn't even wear it on that day. What the hell? Oh my god, no, please. Oh, no. Bobby, no. Bobby, get out of here. What? I no longer have the original stuff for this cosplay. I am kind of a little bit all over the place with this. Of course, I bought all of the fabric 3 years ago. Have no idea how much I got, right? But I had to get new fabric because a while back my mom needed a Mrs. Claus costume and I ended up using my cape fabric and then the bottom of it to make like a gown. My mom took me to the fabric store and we got new red fabric. I have no idea if I have enough. And I still have the rest of the fluffy stuff. This is all I have for things. So I'll probably have to get more things later, but let's just dive right into this. If I remember correctly, I have 2 yards of red fabric, which I definitely needed more and I got more later. And I believe I had 1 yard of that fluffy fabric. Now, because I was determined to get the most out of my 2 yards, I didn't attempt to cut it, or I didn't attempt to make a shape greater than what the fabric was. So I kind of laid it over my mannequin with the uniform and then laid it over myself to make sure that I liked the length of it and I was dead set on that being the length. Next came the long and tedious task of ironing the entire fabric. This red fabric has been in my drawer folded up for over a year, right? So of course the creases were very indented and it took a really long time to iron it out, and even then the creases are still some of the greater ones are still kind of visible, which does bother me, but overall I ironed out so much of everything. Next, I decided to drape the fabric over my mannequin. I basically pinned the red top of it to the back of the neck of the uniform, right? And this was just to help me visually see how much I wanted to take in near the shoulders. So this was just to help me visually see how much I wanted to take in around the shoulders. I know I wanted it to be a curved shape. Of course, I didn't want my cape to be just a massive rectangle, but this helped me decide, how much in further, and I basically just folded it to the side and pinned it and kind of compared it to the pictures. Now, once I decided that that's how I liked it, I basically laid the fabric out, folded it in half to make it easier for cutting, and instead of using a marker, I decided to use water and a paintbrush because the fabric soaked up water and I really didn't want to leave any marker marks this time, so I basically drew out my line with water, and then when I decided that it was the shape that I wanted, I just cut the top and the bottom. Not a lot of cutting. I basically used all of the fabric except for the corners. After that, I went ahead and I measured out about 9 inches each. I basically cut all of my fluffy fabric out in 3 long sections. That way it would go around the entire edge of the red fabric except for on the top where I know I was going to put the collar and the hood. So once I figured out that 9 inches was enough, I cut the fluffy stuff into 3 pieces. Then once they were all cut, I started to pin it to the bottom and all around. I was very particular with the way that I wanted it to lay. So, I mean, if you have fluffy fabric and it's kind of falling a certain way, like when you brush it and you want it to be the other way, just, I guess, flip it. It really depends on what kind of look you're going for. And I wanted it to be fluffy, so I made sure to go kind of, I think, with the grain, or I'm not really sure what the how to say this. Either way, during this whole cape making process, I'm sorry if it seems a little back and forth. A lot of times I had to actually use my hands and start hand sewing, and it made my fingers really numb, so it took a lot out of my hands. So I'm sorry if I'm switching back and forth between certain steps. It's because I'm giving my fingers a break and my mind a break from just sitting for hours and hand sewing something. So once the entire edge was pinned, I just sewed it all on. I'm not really sure what the best way is to sew on faux fur, but I can tell you, after I cut it, it shed like crazy. I went through so many lint rollers trying to get it to stop, and I think at this point I had to go and take a shower because I rubbed fur in my eyes. It takes a lot out of you. For some reason, I didn't decide to lint roll it after I cut it. I lint rolled as I went, so it was upsetting. After I sewed the first line of the faux fur, I decided to drape it over myself just for fun and to see how it was. I don't know, I really wanted to put it on, and I was like, oh yes, I'm fancy with my cape, and to see how long it was, and if, I like the way that it was looking so far. So my mom took me out to get me the last of the supplies I need. We got 2 more yards of this fabric. This was the original, and this is the closest we could find. Of course, on video they look the same, but in person this one's slightly lighter, and it has a different edge. And it's a little more stretchy, but this will be used for the hood and the collar. We got this cord. I have no idea what it's called, but it's going to be used to tie around the entire cape. 2 yards of this 3/8 inch daffodil cord. And then 10 feet of this solid bare copper wire. And it says 8-1. I have no idea the thickness, but I definitely won't need all 10 feet. It was 35 cents a foot. Do you remember in the beginning when I said that I had sewed part of the faux fur I had onto a costume for my mom? Well, I needed it. I definitely needed it, and I needed it for basically the neck hood area. Either way, I had to seam rip all of it off, which took a while because of course it's faux fur and it's all everywhere, and it's really difficult to see where your threads are basically. So I put a towel on myself to avoid getting faux fur in my pajama pants so I wouldn't have to lint roll my body, and I just sat down and listened to music and just seam ripped. Originally, when I planned out this cosplay, I was just going to make a collar and I wasn't going to make a hood. Now, the hood came about because I was looking at pictures and I was like, is that a hood? Is it? Because it kind of looks like a hood on the back of his cape. It's not, he never puts it over his head, right? You can never tell, but there's this one manga picture, right, where it looks like it's a hood. So there's something going on back there, and I showed my mom the pictures, and she was like, that's definitely a hood, and I was like, oh my god, I'm gonna have to make a hood. But whatever. My mom took me to Joann's to get more fabric, obviously, because I ran out, and I had extra to make the collar and the hood now. The hood I was using, I actually took the pattern off of my jacket hood, which was 3 pieces, and I already cut out a hood out of red fabric for a hoodie I was making. So I was like, oh, I'm not gonna, make another hood pattern. I already cut this one out. And I basically took those pieces and just put them on there and then cut them out. So I recommend if there's a hood you like on a jacket or a hoodie, just trace that out on the fabric and cut it out. And I'm sure it'll work great. I cut out 2 of each pattern piece because I was basically making 2 hoods And then I was going to sew them together that way, like all the seams would be on the inside, and then you would see a nice outlined seam. I know it sounds kind of weird. It ended up being like a really thick hood. So once I was done cutting out all of the pieces, I basically just pinned the lines together, and then I sewed all of the lines. For the outside seam, I basically like pin the whole top of it and then pin the two seams together, making sure to push the seam allowance towards the middle, because that's the way that my jacket hood was sewn, and I thought I would just end up doing it the same way. And then from there, after I did each one, I basically did a top seam on my sewing machine, sewing the seam allowance that was inside, going on that side. So these I did one by one, and there's my mom's cat on the table. He really wanted attention. He's so cute. And once I was done, I sewed along the whole outside of the hood, not the back where it would be touching your neck, kind of like where your face is, around that curve mark, and just sewed kind of a close line. That way the pieces wouldn't, fly away from each other, and they would be good for when I would sew the faux fur to it. So next step, making the collar piece. I kind of traced out a piece that looked like his collar on a piece of paper to kind of help myself figure out where I wanted it. I used the edge of the hood to make a line for myself because I wanted the collar piece to be just as long as the neck piece of the hood. And then from there, when I finally got the shape down that I liked, I just cut out the piece. Now I cut out two pieces and I basically pinned them together. And then after that, I sewed the two pieces together. When I sewed them together, I stopped halfway down the middle and then basically made kind of like a hole and then kept going. And that hole is meant to be for the wire, because the wire was going to be like a little extra piece down the back. That way it didn't kind of cave in when I was wearing the whole cape. So if I wanted to, I could adjust the wire and make the back of the collar look taller or shorter. Now that the collar piece is all nice and sewn together, I flipped it inside out and then started to slowly iron it. It took a while to iron. This was kind of thick fabric and it wasn't really sitting in the place that I wanted it to, so I basically had to hold it as I ironed it. If you have fabric like this, be very careful. I always touch the iron with my fingers like an idiot, so please be careful. Once I was done ironing out all of the edges, I started to paint the embellishments, I guess is the right word. It's the three little nubs, the three things on the collar. I'll throw up a picture and like zoom in on it. That thing right there. That's what I'm painting on the corners. This took a while. I basically mixed up a concoction of like the yellows that I had and the sparkly gold paint I had and fabric median. And I was trying to get to the closest color of the, what's it called? Of the rope thing that I got. I just said what it was. You know what I'm talking about. It looks like a braid, like a yellow braid. So yeah, that rope thing, I was trying to get it to as close of a color to that thing as I could, because I knew in the end I was just gonna repaint over that, but this was just the base color of paint. Now, to get it to be darker, I had to do multiple layers, so I would leave it and then I would come back and do layer after layer after each paint had dried, and I did one of those symbols on like each side, so both sides had one of those embellishments on it. So in between the layers of paint drying, I decided to take my rope thing, and I started to kind of roll in the wire. I ended up ruining this later and had to redo it, but this shows pretty much what I'm doing more clearly. I'm basically taking the edge of it and kind of wrapping it around and entangling the piece of wire inside of it. So I'm trying to embed the wire inside of the rope. That way, when the collar's all finished, I can bend it as I please and then kind of make the shape of his actual cape. See, when it comes to a lot of cosplay stuff, like when you see the fabric and you see the look of it, you're like, oh, that looks so effortlessly, but if you were to just make it with regular fabric, it would basically fall flat. So I was like, I need wire, and I thought this would be the best way. Instead of sewing it inside of the collar, I thought this would work out much better. We've made it to the Christmas roll, in a hot minute, we're going to come back to this section so you'll fully understand what I'm doing. I'm trying to finish off the cape and sew on that other side of the faux fur. I wasn't going to leave it open. I was going to sew it to the other side. That way the seam would be trapped on the inside. For some reason, I didn't know how I was going to do it, and through my mind, instead of sewing it on the top against the fur, I thought, no, I don't want to sew it on the top. I want to sew it on the inside, which I can't even explain why I did it. Like right now, I'm like, yeah, that was a great idea. And in the moment, I was like, I can't believe I'm doing it like this, but that's how I did it. So in turn, it ended up making a Christmas roll that I sewed. I was trapping all of the cape to the inside and then pulling over the faux fur. That way the whole like inside of the faux fur, that part without the fur, was showing. And then I would sew the other side and pull it out, kind of like a tube. Now that I was advancing with my weird faux fur technique, I decided to fix the two pieces that I had seam ripped and set aside. They were basically like 6 inches wide, and I decided to re-sew them together. That way all the fabric was flowing the same way. So I was tucking in all of the faux fur. That way when I sewed it and opened it back up, it would look like it was one whole piece. Once I had sewn it together, I decided to do the same thing I did with the huge cape piece. I pinned the faux fur to the whole like outside lining of the hood around that line for your face. And I had to make sure that the way I was pinning it, when it would meet up with the other edge of the other side of the fur, right, all of it would be flowing in the same direction. Because once you start sewing them together and it flows a different way, it's kind of noticeable. So after I pinned it all together, there was obviously a lot extra, and that was going to be sewn to the cape because that's as much extra as I needed. I ended up having like just enough fur for the whole line of the cape, which I was so excited for. After I sewed it together, here you can kind of see the technique that I was doing with the cape. I was pulling the faux fur around and tucking in all of the red fabric and making like a Christmas roll, like a tube, a cinnamon roll but Christmas. And I would pin it together. That way everything was on the inside, and then from there I would sew on that line and basically pull everything out and just flip it inside out basically. Oh God, look at this absolute failure. Look at this failure. Look at this loser. Oh my God. So, like an idiot, I was like, oh right, I made a hole in the collar part, so I'm gonna unroll part of my rope thing and pull some of the wire out from inside of it. That way I could just tuck it right into the hole, right? Nope. This did not work out well, and I basically had to re-put the rope on in certain spots. I kind of ruined the rope at a certain section. So because the wire was flat, the rope went like perfectly on it, and then when I started to mess it up and unroll it, I was kind of ruining the way that it was turning. And it was kind of unraveling in the middle, in the area that I was trying to, add a piece of wire into. So at a certain point, I just dead stopped and had to refix it. And now you can see pretty much what I was going for. I was trying to get just a little piece of wire that was tucking out of it. That way I could slip it into the collar. Now this was so that it sits on the back of my neck without caving in, which was my mom's idea, so thank you to my mom for her idea on the wire. But I had such a struggle getting it through, and eventually I got it, which took a while. So now that it was totally in the rope thing, all the wire was ready, I started to sew it against that seam line. I was basically hiding the seam line with the rope and the wire, and I was trying to go, I believe the term is in the ditch, and I was hand sewing it onto the ditch of the collar piece. I apologize for the weird angle here. Because of how the wire was in the shape of the collar, I could not stay in one place as I was sewing this. So I'm going to try to explain this the best that I could. I was basically poking through the ditch of the collar, pulling my needle out, and then wrapping it around the rope. That way I was going into the grooves and the thread was hiding, and I would pull it around and then poke it back through, right? And I would do that, and as I was going with the way that the rope was turning and slowly going down the edge. So this is me doing the first half of the rope, and obviously doing that point corner piece was a lot, and as I was sewing it in, I was bending it to the shape of the collar. Oh my gosh, we've made it to the Christmas roll. What is that? Why? I don't understand what's wrong with me. Honestly, I don't get it. When it comes to sewing things, there are just these moments where things just don't click, and I'm like, you know what? Screw this, and I just keep going and don't think. So, because I had sewn a little bit of each corner already, I decided that I would basically pull the seam through and flip it inside out, and just like you saw with the hood, I was doing that slowly across the whole edge. Now, I couldn't do this in one go because, of course, the cape was way too thick and it wouldn't pin all together inside of the tube, right? So I had to do this in slow, small sections, and for some reason my sewing machine just couldn't handle it. So as I did each tube, I would hand sew for hours. I was just sitting in my sewing room listening to music and sometimes just in dead silence thinking about my life. And I would just pin it together, hand sew it as much as I could, re-pull it out, and then just continually do that along the edge. It would have been a lot better in the end if I had started on one edge of the faux fur and then went all the way to the other side, but because I sewed each of the top edges, I was basically trying to meet into the middle at the bottom. Now, at the end of this, my fingers were absolutely numb. I ended up using the pliers that I used to cut the wire to pull my needle through because my fingers just couldn't grasp anything. They hurt really bad, and at one point I was like licking my fingers. I can't even explain why. This is how I decided to sew this. And you know what? If you're gonna do this, just sew on the top. Just sew it right on the top. You know what you're gonna want to do? It's because I sewed the inside first. The way that I decided to do it was I decided to sew in the side that would be touching the ground first and then sew the top part after. Nope, reverse that. If you see what I did, do the same thing, but sew the side that you want to be facing the world first, and then when you flip it over, just top sew it. Just top sew it. I can't even. If you're doing this, I wish you the best of luck. I wish you the best of luck with this.
Look, this is it.
Oh my god, you could hear the pain in my voice. I was so happy I was close to the end, and for some reason I decided to do this in one go. I was like, I'm not gonna quit, and it just got visibly darker in the room. When I finally got to the last section, of course I couldn't do the roll thing I was doing because that required there to be a hole. This is why I was like, oh, it would have been better if I did it through the side, because now there was no way that I could exit the roll, right? So I eventually did have to do a weird, not exactly a top sew. I didn't want it to be on top of the faux fur, so I kind of sewed it how I sew stuffed animals closed, where you want the seam hidden. Like, if you go to Build-A-Bear, you've definitely seen it, how they close the back of the bear shut, kind of like that. That's how I sewed it together. I was basically trying to form a fake seam and hand sew it without the seam being visible. And now we're back to more hand sewing with Bruce, my lovely baby. He decided to sit up on the table with me because he needed attention and against me while I was sewing, and I just had to stop and then, come back in a little bit after I had loved him enough. Now I was sewing the other half of the collar piece, doing the same thing as I was before, just looping it around and making sure that the thread was in between the lines of the braided part, right? Now, when I got to each edge, I didn't sew it right to the edge. I kind of left a little bit of fabric at each corner, you know, where the seams were, just so that when I would sew it to the hood, it wouldn't be directly against the wire piece. That way I had just a little bit of play. So because it was so easy to unravel the braided area, I broke out fabric glue. I can't stop myself from breaking out fabric glue in every possible project. Paint and fabric glue. They're recipes for disaster, honestly, but you know what? I'm giving myself props for this because it actually worked because I gave it enough time to dry. 2 to 4 hours to dry, just ooh. Because it was unraveling, and that's basically how I got it to get around the wire, I decided to paint the fabric glue into the lines of like the spiral. That way when I would unroll it, it wouldn't unroll everything and kind of make the wire visible. Of course, since I already sewed it on, this wasn't that big of a deal, but it was that edge that I was worried about. So I basically like painted over it. I used a paintbrush and I painted fabric glue on it, and of course it did work in the end, and it would make it easier when I were to cut it. That way all of it wouldn't unravel away and fray away. The fabric glue was basically locking it as one unit. Now at this point it was really late at night and I was like, oh, I might as well do one more thing before I go to bed. I pinned the hood onto the collar. Now my collar piece was obviously just a straight edge of fabric, and the points, it was way longer than the hood length was. So I just pinned it on, definitely to the side that I wanted to be the outside, right? So right edges together, and just sewed that on really quickly. I say really quickly, I was tired. I was like, I'm gonna sew this on really quick before I go to bed, and I thought, oh, might as well do one more thing, and I set the cape onto my mannequin and decided to do just a lint roll. I mean, I had just finished sewing the faux fur on, and I knew the next step would be to connect the pieces that were on the hood to the pieces that were on the entire cape line. So I decided, screw it, I'm gonna lint roll everything right now, because I was tired of getting fur into my eyes. You know, it's so weird, like my eyes felt itchy and I was like, oh, let me rub my eye, and proceeded to rub just remnants of fluff into my eyeball just like an idiot. So lint rolling, you're gonna need a lot of lint rollers. I can't express this enough. My mom took me to Walmart and I bought 3 and I ran through like 2 of them just lint rolling my person. Now, of course, you don't have to lint roll anything. You could wait till the end. It's my pet peeve. I needed to lint roll my body for some reason every day. Next morning, I'm awake and ready, probably still empty inside. I used a pair of scissors to kind of cut the rope around the wire, and then I used my cutters to actually cut the wire off. The fabric glue did help a lot, and it just basically held its shape perfectly, and I kind of left probably like half an inch, maybe like a centimeter off the edge of the red fabric, just so that I could tuck it in and it wouldn't like pop back out when I was sewing. I'm gonna try to explain this part as best as I can. I ended up messing up when I was sewing this and sewed only half of it and then went back later, but the parts are still basically the same. So I picked the side that I wanted to be up front, and then I basically pin the collar to the seam allowance of the hood on the inside, right? And from there, I sewed it to the seam allowance basically on the hood, so there would be an open part right on the back. So the inside was totally enclosed except for the top part where the hood and the collar were to meet in the middle, I guess. I mean, because the collar is double-sided, it's hard to say which side is the right side. So I basically had the collar pressed up against the inside of the cape and then sewed it to the seam allowance of the hood. So on one side was the collar and the other side was the hood, and the seam allowance was smack in between them. So you're about to see me biff this or whiff this. I whiffed this moment so badly. So I ran into a problem. The red embellishment thing, the little tassels, it wasn't long enough. I was planning to have it
inside. I was basically going to sew it in the seam allowance around the collar. That way I could pull it as tight as I wanted to when I put on the cape, right? But it wasn't long enough. Yeah, so in a moment of panic, I went into my drawers and I found a thing of twine, and it was the only thing that I could find that was thick enough and tough enough. So as you can see, I basically like cut out a piece of twine, and you can see that the collar is basically folded on top of the hood, and when I fold it back towards me, that's where the seam allowance is. So I'm basically trying to pin in the seam allowance, that way I can sew on top of the collar and then catch the hood on the other side, right? And as I'm doing this, I'm pinning in the piece of twine. I said it was twine, right? Yeah. Inside of it, that way it could move freely. I didn't want to sew the twine because then that would defeat the purpose of tightening it around myself, right? So I was gonna basically sew a pocket, and the seam allowance would be within the pocket with the twine inside of it. Now, doing this was probably the worst moment in sewing. So right now you're looking at basically the inside. So this is the collar piece that's going to be against my head, and the hood is on the underside, right? And I pulled the hood out, that way I would catch it, and then the seam would be on the other side, so you wouldn't see the seam on the top part of the hood, right? Now, for some reason, my sewing machine couldn't catch the fabric. It wasn't catching it properly, and there was a bunch of gaps in the thread, so this did not look pretty at all, and I didn't know whether I wanted to sew over it. I just ended up leaving it. So yeah, I sewed that down as best as I could, and it turned out alright, and I didn't end up catching the twine at any point. That way I could pull it freely through the opening. So right here you can see a lot better. That is basically the inside of the cape, and you can see how I sewed it just on that top line. Now, right now I am attempting to connect the faux fur. So I am pinning the two edges together, that way I can sew them, that way they'll be like one continuous piece, and then I can finally close it off. And that's my mom's cat, Bubby. Again, he really insisted on being in the room with me. During this step, I realized that I had left the points of the original cape, and I just kind of like sliced them off and curved off the edges. And then from there, now that the faux fur was together, I could go in the sewing machine and sew them. But like I said before, the hood faux fur piece and the one that was around the cape was slightly like longer. So each of the edges on the hood part ended up being just a little bit longer, but I evened it out. That way it wouldn't be such a great difference on one side than the other. Before I do anything else, before I even finish off the fur, it was time to do my last coat of paint. The embellishments around the collar were kind of bland. They were plain, they just looked like yellow. Of course it had some shine to it, but it didn't look kind of gold like I wanted it to look. So I mixed gold fabric, and I still had the original glitter glue that I was going to use back like years ago. So I decided to dump out like practically the whole thing of glitter glue into my mixing cup, a little bit of gold paint, and a little bit of fabric medium. And from there, I used that weird mixture to paint over the rope embellishment and the design that I had made on the corners. This definitely made everything look so much nicer. I ended up doing, I believe, 2 coats on each side, and then of course touch-ups here and there. I was trying to carefully do like a nice thin layer, that way it wasn't too thick and it wouldn't take away from what the rope actually looked like. Kind of just awkwardly like on the floor doing this. I ended up taking this up into my room and setting it on my bed, and then I would from there, after each coat had dried, just do another one. The paint ended up being a lot thinner than it looked in the cup. It was because of all of the glue, so it looked a lot more watery than I thought it would, but I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It's a big boy. It's gonna be so big. Oof. Oof. There's Bruce. So right here, this is what 2 layers look like. And as you can see, it's kind of starting to morph into the same color. I think I'm going to stop at this 2 layers because I like the way that it looks. And it looks a lot more like gold. So here's kind of a brighter side. So here's what the painted side looks like, 2 layers, and then here is the original side, which doesn't look, you know, as nice and shiny as the new side does. It looks very plain on the other side, so there. Now I'm just gonna do 2 layers of the paint on the other side. Wow, this was the last major step. Absolute pain. Absolute pain. There was no way I was gonna do this through my sewing machine. So I decided that I was going to hand sew again, and being smart this time, I brought it up into my room and kind of laid it onto my leg, and I was watching YouTube videos the entire time. It was a lot better than sitting in my sewing room in dead silence thinking about my life while I hand sew. What I was doing was I was sewing in one side and basically fixing the corners of the collar, the embellishments. I was trying to go around the rope and make sure that I was closing off anything that was still open and any weird little sewing things that didn't get sewn together. And then from there, I would loop it around and basically fold over the faux fur over that edge where the wire ended. That way it would be pocketed in, but also pulling out the twine. That way that wasn't sewn in. If it's sewn in, that ruins it, right? So I pulled that out, that way I could still use it towards the end. And then did the same thing like I did before, my weird closing a stuffy shut, sewing a stuffed animal closed. I don't know what the stitch name is, but I was basically just kind of like looping through the same way I did before and closing up the seam. I was really excited that I could like finally get this done. This was kind of like the last major piece of the costume, was sewing this together, and then I could finally move on to the last step. This is it. We have finally made it to the last step. I'm just setting it up on my mannequin, and I can bend the collar as I please to kind of get that shape of his, because one side is kind of turned over and another side is almost upright, so I could manipulate it as I wanted to. And I was trying to figure out the best place to pull the twine. I ended up slowly bunching it up, that way it would fit around my shoulders properly. And then from there, I'm kind of like blocking myself because I'm holding it with my teeth awkwardly. I don't know why I'm standing right in front of my mannequin. But basically I would take the twine and I would tie it into a knot a couple times. That way it would lock the cape like shoulders in place, right? So it would stay just at that mark, because that's how much I wanted it open. And then from there I cut the twine shorter, and then I tied the red dangly embellishment thing to the edge. So because it was too short, I ended up cutting it in half into 2 pieces and then just tying it on the edge of the twine and then hiding the twine on the inside near the fluff piece, right? You can't really see it. And then from there, it would look like the red thing was the original rope, which was what I wanted to. So here it is. Here is the whole finished king cape, king of the court. I'm so glad I finally finished this after years. I'm sorry it's so dark in my sewing room. I'll be sure to add in some nice shots during actual daylight when it's not dark outside. This didn't take me very long to make, and I'm shocked that it took me 3 years to just spend like 2 weeks making this. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this video, and what kind of cosplay video would it be if I didn't attempt to try to awkwardly put it on and wear the cosplay that I made? It was rather heavy. It was heavier than I thought it would be, and it took me like a little bit to figure out how to put it on, but I loved it. I really loved it. I mean, honestly, take away the uniform and I look like I'm wearing like a Christmas cape. It's Christmas time. I'm ready for like a fancy Christmas party. So, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Birthday to Kageyama. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me, and I hope you have a lovely day.